few things about Xinjiang, all right? So I think what we can conclude, okay, from the propaganda about Xinjiang is one, it's lies. We can just go through really quickly, right? Genocide. The population of the Uyghurs in the Uyghur Autonomous Region, which is the only reason it's called the Uyghur Autonomous Region is because Uyghurs are the majority. That's how it works in China's autonomous regions. That's why they're called autonomous regions, is because ethnic minorities actually make up the majority of the population in that region. And that population of the Uyghurs has gone up by a quarter, 25%, in a decade's time. So uh, 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 it's ridiculous, right? From about 2009-10 to 2018, 25% increase in the population. So obviously there isn't a genocide. The state isn't just wantonly, isn't going around killing Uyghurs, and isn't going around making their conditions worse. Because another propaganda point is that there's cultural genocide. And I want to reiterate Jerry's point here about the cultural genocide. For one, there's tens of thousands of mosques. I think more than 20,000 mosques in Xinjiang. It's one of the most, in terms of in the entire world, Xinjiang occupies some of the most mosques in the world. So there isn't a cultural genocide of people who practice Islam or Uyghurs who practice Islam. And those two things aren't necessarily they're not, it's not a one-to-one thing, right? This is the racism that gets into Western propaganda. It's almost like all Uyghurs are the same, right? That's not true. Uyghurs are an ethnic minority doesn't mean that they all practice the same religion, even though the majority practice Islam. And then when it comes to cultural genocide, if it's not the population, it's not the people who are being genocided. Well, culturally, when I was there, it's so obvious that a cultural genocide does not include, and it doesn't include that here in the United States, right? We don't see Spanish everywhere. We don't even see Spanish everywhere in places where people are dominant Spanish speakers, right? Come here to the tippy top of Manhattan, right, where it's a majority Dominican population. And I can tell you that very few of the signs, zero of the signs, nothing public, nothing by the government, nothing at all. I mean, some businesses, yeah, because they're owned by Spanish speakers, but nothing from the government is in Spanish. Nothing at all. Not the park signs, not the street signs, nothing. Despite the fact that most people's first language in this part of New York City is Spanish. But in China, when I was in Xinjiang, when I was in Iramuchi, everywhere, all the public signs, everything by that sponsored by the government has both Mandarin and the Uyghur language, its style of Turkish. That was everywhere. That's just undisputed. And when you go there, you see people in their traditional dress, you see people practicing their traditional dance. It's just so easy to debunk, and the Western media doesn't want to do it. They don't even want to go. They just want to pretend like they can't go. So that is just one point. And then I want to make one final point about this because, it's one thing to say, right, that conditions have gotten better for Uyghurs. They live more than twice the years since the Chinese Revolution, right? Many of them died at the age of 35 or younger, pre 1949. After 1949, the life expectancy for Uyghurs is very close to that of Han Chinese and other ethnic groups in China. So the disparity is very, very small, and it's becoming parity very, very, very fast. Economic growth in Xinjiang actually is bigger than most regions, right? It's average about 9% per year. Much more economic growth than even some other parts of China, right? So there's been a lot of investment in the people's livelihoods. 3 million people alone in 2020 to end extreme poverty in Xinjiang were lifted out of extreme poverty. So there's been a lot of real attempts by the Chinese government to make life better. But if you don't want to take my word on that, right? Because I mean that's all based on facts. This isn't just me spewing my opinion. But if that doesn't matter, if that's like, okay, well, yeah, but bad things could still be happening there. Well, it's hard to verify bad things happening when one, there is no existing legitimate source verifying this. And we can't say that Uyghur people are some kind of victims, that people in Xinjiang are all victims. They have phones, they have computers, they have the ability to access internet. There are a lot of people in Xinjiang that have VPNs, and they do YouTube and they do Twitter, and they've been taken off of YouTube and Twitter. I used to follow people. I would have loved to bring them on the show, but they're no longer on these platforms because they've been taken off as Chinese propaganda. So I think the most important thing that we should remember about Xinjiang is that the narrative that we're hearing is all US government sponsored. I'm just going to go over one by one by one, and then I'll make a final point, okay? Because the most important point, in my opinion. So I'm going to go one by one by one, okay? In terms of how these sources that we're hearing from are literally US government affiliated. So, Radio Free Asia is a subsidiary of the US Agency for Global Media. Okay. That means they are part of a literal media organization funded by the US government. Radio Free Asia is not independent. It was literally founded by the CIA in right after the Chinese Revolution, 1951. And then it went from being a straight up CIA apparatchik to then becoming subsumed in this larger reform project, right? To make it more of a so-called public entity rather than this secret Cold War agency, which used to be called Board of Broadcast Governors. And so this is it. This is the U.S. Agency for Global Media, and they receive money from the U.S. government. You know, almost $1 billion here, almost a $500 million there. So U.S. Congress gives this money each and every year to these organizations like Radio Free Asia. So there you have it. U.S. Agency for Global Media, Radio Free Asia, constantly talking about how Uyghurs are being forced to dance in Kashgar and all of this nonsense, right? They're just promoting a U.S. government line on Xinjiang. And then let's look at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. We talked about it, but let's just look at it really quickly. Here is the funders for the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. And one thing that we didn't mention in the conversation is that since 2001, since the Australian Strategic Policy Institute was founded, the Australian government has doled out $52 billion. That's a lot of money in Australia. 52 billion US dollars in military contracts, to military and weapons manufacturers. So, despite this so-called small number that only 3% of defense industries fund this organization, it is literally an organization that lobbies for this. Everything that it does is lobbying for more government contracts to military contractors. That's why the Department of Defense funds it in Australia, funds it 37%. Federal government agencies, which includes the Defense Department, make up the other 25%. So more than half of its funding is from the West, is from Australia and the United States' government. And in 2021, as the U.S. in December, as the U.S. had introduced and Biden had signed off on the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute received an office in Washington, D.C. This is how intertwined the politics and propaganda of Xinjiang are. So that's just another thing. And then I'm going to show you just, the proof is in the pudding. Okay. So Mr. Adrian Zenz, he's a far-right Christian fundamentalist. He really does believe what he says because he's a crusader for right-wing reaction. He's a racist. He hates China because China is socialist and it's ungodly to him. And China actually does clamp down on extremist religions, whether it's the lamas from that were based in Tibet, or whether it's the Falun Gong, or whether It's people like Adrian Zenz who promote incredibly harmful socially, politically, and economically ideologies and cloak them in religion. And so here he is. He's a senior fellow. He's a director in China Studies at the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. What is that? That is a so-called educational research and human rights nonprofit organization commemorating the more than 100 million victims of communism, blah, blah, blah. But how was it founded? It was authorized in 1993 by a unanimous act of Congress, signed as public law by William J. Clinton, aka Bill Clinton, in 1993. And on 2007, George W. Bush dedicated the Victims of Communism Memorial Statue in Washington, D.C. So it's literally a Bush Clinton neocon anti-communist project, and that's what Adrian Zenz works for. He's actually the highest up. That's what it's all about, okay? So it's one by one by one, right? We can see that the sources, right? And we didn't even go over the National Endowment for Democracy with the World Uyghur Congress, the so-called Uyghur Tribunal, all of these entities that literally just spew propaganda on behalf of the United States' government. And now I want to just show you a few more things to summarize the why point, because this, in my opinion, is the most important thing. It's not just that they're telling lies. The United States is telling lies, but lies always have a purpose. Propaganda, a mythology, right? War propaganda always has a purpose. It's not benign. It's not just because the United States is just white supremacist, which it is. It's not just because it's an imperialist and it just wants to look down upon China. Not untrue, but this isn't the principal contradiction. I want you to look at one. Jerry mentioned a lot of oil in Xinjiang. And today, this is a story from today, right? Xinjiang is a very resource-rich region and now has discovered, Sinopec has discovered 1.7 billion ton oil reserves in Xinjiang. That's not today. Well, that's a couple days ago. But we can expect probably to hear much more about so-called human rights in Xinjiang now that this has been found, because we know that imperialism loves to steal oil. It's doing so right now in Syria. It's stealing Syrian oil, occupied oil from the northeast region of Syria, and transporting that to Iraq and using it for its own purposes. And it's doing that by the thousands of tons of barrels, right? We're talking about just a complete theft of resources. So one by one by one. And then the most important thing about this, right? Not just that there's oil there, but that Xinjiang represents a very important part of China's overall geostrategic and geopolitical vision and its overall foreign policy and how it conducts foreign policy. Because without being able to get out of Xinjiang, a lot of China would be landlocked from the West. So China has spent a lot of time and investment in Xinjiang, because not just because of domestic priorities, poverty alleviation, trying to correct uneven development, and trying to bring more unity, both nationally, politically, economically. But also we have the Belt and Road Initiative, which is kind of the way that China sees its role in the world and its need to both, one, be able to give its economy a break, right? We're talking about a socialist market economy that is becoming huge and that needs to be able to develop ties with other parts of the world in order to kind of unload a lot of what it has developed. It can't, right? It's just the way it's supplying. It just cannot be met by demand. We're talking about a rapidly industrializing economy. So the Belt and Road Initiative is a perfect way to give back while also being able to continue on growing without some of the contradictions that come with extremely high rates of growth. So the Belt and Road Initiative serves many purposes, but for one, it serves the purpose of trying to lift all boats globally. And so CGTN, and we'll just play this video. CGTN has a video about how Xinjiang is the gateway to the Belt and Road Initiative. So let's just watch this so you get a picture of how important it is.
Xinjiang has been at the core of China's trade relations across the Eurasian landmass since the millennia-old ancient Silk Road. Owing to its strategic location as China's westernmost frontier that borders 8 countries including Mongolia, Russia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India, Xinjiang today is fittingly seen as the gateway to the Belt and Road Initiative, or BRI.
在去年，召开的第3次中央新疆工作座谈会上，这个习近平总书记特别提出，新疆要发挥好区位优势，以丝绸之路经济带核心区的建设作为载体。
我们都是要通过发展贸易，通过这种文化的交流，给沿线国家带来经济的繁荣。
In recent years, as part of China's BRI push, Xinjiang has witnessed rapid infrastructure development. The Urumqi International Land Port in Xinjiang's capital city has been created as an integrated rail, road, and flight logistics hub to facilitate trade with not only the neighboring countries, but all the way up to Europe via the China-Europe Railway Express.
我们开行的项目有19条，到达21个国家、26个城市。陆港区有相对服务优势的区域呢，主要是新疆周边的中亚地区，包括俄罗斯以及跨里海、黑海所辐射的沿线的国家。
Meanwhile, Xinjiang's other major city, Kashgar, has been serving as the only special economic zone in Western China since 2010. As part of the SEZ, the city has established the Kashgar Comprehensive Free Trade Zone, eyeing to boost trade with neighboring countries.
喀什综合保税区，目前以2020年的数据来看，它的进出口贸易额达到了7.5个亿人民币啊，但是其中呢，应该在80%左右是出口货物啊，进口货物占到了大概20%的规模啊。我们主要的贸易伙伴的话，是包括主要是周边几个国家，包括吉尔吉斯斯坦、塔吉克斯坦啊、乌兹别克斯坦等等。
While boosting employment opportunities for youths, the BRI-linked projects in past few years are proving to be a boon for Xinjiang's local industries and enterprises, opening up new international markets for them and at the same time cutting down transportation time and cost.
我举个例子，原来新疆的番茄酱要通过汽运或者火车运到天津港，再下海坐轮船到欧洲的市场，这个周期基本上要在45天以上。那现在中欧班列这条通道开通之后在乌鲁木齐集结中心形成集结，通过中欧班列运输，我们到意大利那不勒斯这个地方大概在15天左右。
The BRI-linked development of Xinjiang is equally focused on international as well as domestic connectivity of the region. The Lanzhou-Xinjiang high-speed railway that opened in 2014
That's the one, Lanzhou. That's the one I took. So, I wish I had remembered. For Jerry, I still have the ticket somewhere, but I took that one. It was a great ride. I loved it. Lanzhou. That's where we had to go from Donghuang, and it only took like for a little bit over 4 hours. It was an incredible trip.
Connecting Xinjiang to neighboring Gansu province has been transformative for the tourism sector.
新高铁自开行以来，我们新疆铁路运用了这个周末动车、假日动车、重联动车组方式，增加了咱们的日常公交化。对咱们这个乌鲁木齐、吐鲁番北、陕善北等哈密地区的旅游开发业也有所提高。比如说像我们的杏花专列，我们可以到吐鲁番北去看杏花；陕善北我们有库木塔格沙漠，可以去库木塔格玩沙子；哈密我们有巴里坤。那么增加了这个旅游圈、经济圈和生活圈的大力发展。
From the ancient Silk Road to the ongoing Belt and Road Initiative, Xinjiang continues to flourish as a major trading hub for China. It has now also emerged as a perfect example of China's recent emphasis on dual circulation economic strategy.
由东向西来看呢，乌鲁木齐国际陆港区处在 向西开放的国内的末端啊，但是从西向东来看，我们又处在进口的这个桥头堡啊，所以呢，这也是乌鲁木齐国际陆港区的一个独特的区位和地理的优势。
So there you have it. There you have it, everyone. It's important. It's an incredibly important, it's an incredibly important place. Xinjiang, incredibly important to the Belt and Road Initiative. This connectivity is very important. And as someone said in the chat, yes, the development of Xinjiang as the hub of the Belt and Road Initiative means that China can bypass, and this is very important. And remember, the United States has militarized the Asia Pacific by sea, South China Sea, and of course, more broadly. The United States has placed its military apparatus basically entirely there, more than half, pointing at China. We're going to talk to John Pilger, hopefully, in the second to last week of August. We're going to talk about this because he made a great film, The Coming War on China, in 2016, which he has continuously updated through his great work. But by being able to bypass that, right, most trade goes through there, right? We're talking about the freedom of navigation. Almost all global trade goes through there by sea. I think more than 40%. So it's very important, very, very important that we, that we go over this and that we talk about this from the perspective of this Belt and Road Initiative and why the United States wants to stop it. The United States wants to try to contain China, weaken its economy. The way you do that is by trying to create unrest in the West along its border in order to keep it out of Europe from that route, from the land route, and then try to take away the maritime belt, right? That's the belt part of it. Try to take that away through militarization of the East, of the sea, of the territorial waters of China. So we have to look at this as interconnected, but it's not going to work. It's not going to work. China is not going to allow this to happen. Okay? And it's not happening. China continues on. The Belt and Road Initiative is growing. Xinjiang, life is improving. The lies will only serve the purpose of continuing on aggressive U.S. policies, imperialist policies like the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which we covered on this program.